Okay, today we're going to look at another pulpit challenge, and I'd like for us to think about the challenge of preaching with variety. I think all of us, if we're not careful, will fall into a rut and sort of just stay there, become very predictable in our preaching. I had a pastor friend of mine to tell me that when he was growing up, he sat under a pastor who preached 2-point sermons every time, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, for 15 to 20 years. So I'm sure that was a godly pastor, great man. But it'd be good for us to break out of that and come up with some variety in our preaching. I was thinking about the New Testament, and especially Paul, how he preached with variety. Just a couple examples. In Acts 13, Paul is on his first missionary journey. He's at Antioch of Pisidia, and he's in a synagogue. And so he starts his sermon with that Jewish audience who had a Jewish background, Old Testament knowledge. He began with the Exodus. He moved to Canaan, traced the history of Israel through the Old Testament to the coming of the Messiah. But then if you go to his next sermon, Acts 17, when he's at Mars Hill, his audience there is pagan. They had no clue about the Old Testament. So he used variety. He didn't start with the Exodus. He didn't start with the Bible. He started with creation, and then he did move to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. But he changed his method because he was adapting to his audience. So he used variety. And that's what I want us to think about and to put into our preaching as well. So what we've been doing in this in this class is giving the basics of homiletics. And if you look at different textbooks on homiletics, like Tony Merita's Faithful Preaching, Jerry Vine's, Jim Shattuck, Power in the Pulpit, and even one of the older classics, Biblical Preaching by Haddon Robinson, you'll find there basically what we have studied in our class in this session. Just the very basics. You have a main point of the sermon. You have, some call it a proposition, some call it a main point of the sermon. These are a couple of books that I grew up on. This was our textbook when I was here. James Braga, How to Prepare Biblical Messages or Bible Messages, and he used the word proposition. Dr. Delnay, proposition. These are two basic homiletic books, and these three books right here that you have follow that same format. You have a main point, you have main divisions. Under each main division, you have explanation, argumentation, illustration, application. That is very basic to homiletics. And so we're not going to preach like that for the rest of our lives. You will fall into your own style eventually, but you'll have these basics. You may move them around so you don't have cookie cutter sermons, but you're going to have these basics in your sermon. So let's think about that just a little bit. So here's one way to get variety in your preaching, is to move back and forth between deductive and inductive styles. Deductive is basically what we've been doing in our class, where up front you have the main point of the sermon or the proposition or the big idea. Haddon Robinson liked to call it the big idea. Tony Merita uses the main point of the sermon. I like that because in our preaching we can say, here's the main point of my sermon. That communicates better than here's my proposition. Our congregation doesn't quite identify with that. But in a deductive sermon, the main point of the sermon is up front, like we have in these sermons. Then you develop it. But the inductive sermon is the opposite. The main point of the sermon is at the very end. And this is very common in the narratives because, as we'll see in just a minute, that's the nature of a narrative. You have a problem or conflict, and then you have the solution to that. And if you're preaching that narrative, the solution becomes the main point of your sermon. So even preaching narratives will help bring variety into your preaching. But you can use the inductive style even with epistles. And for example, we're in Ephesians. An inductive sermon looks like this. How can you do the main point? You don't mention the main point, but you start preaching on a subject and you say, this is the way you can do this, and this way. And that second point is going to become the main emphasis of your sermon. For example, in the introduction, you'd have your intro step, attention step, introduce the subject step as we've been doing. But then, here's a little variety. Instead of stating the main point of the sermon, ask a question such as, how do believers stand against Satan? And you can say, first of all, this way, by putting on the whole armor of God, and this way, by praying. And the main point of your sermon is praying, putting on the spiritual pieces of that armor has gotten us ready to pray, as Paul indicates in Ephesians chapter 6. And what's interesting, I think, about this passage is, in the whole book of Ephesians, there are 8 lengthy sentences, and that's an interesting study. But the last lengthy sentence is in chapter 6. And that lengthy sentence begins in Ephesians 6, verse 14. And that sentence doesn't end until verse 20. So when Paul starts listing the pieces of armor in verse 14, he doesn't end with verse 17, the last piece of armor, which is the sword of the Spirit. He moves right into prayer. It is as if he's saying, when you get all of this spiritual armor on, go to your knees and do battle in prayer. So that could be the main point of your sermon, is praying, getting in fellowship with God, getting all the pieces in place, and then praying. So that would be an inductive. That would add variety to your preaching. So here's 10 different narrative styles that you can use. And the first 3 are deductive, so I'm not going to spend any time on them because that's what we've been doing this semester. But here's narratives that basically are inductive, beginning with biblical problem, biblical solution. These narrative styles are based on that basic nature of a narrative. So you would discuss the problem, and then you would discuss the solution. Point 1, problem. Point 2, solution. So here's a variety of that hidden outline style. Now, if you study narratives and homiletic books that focus on narratives, they're going to mention these styles. So the hidden outline style is so simple. It's the biblical problem, biblical solution, without you emphasizing point 1 and point 2. You just talk about the biblical problem, and then you move into the biblical solution without giving the points of a normal sermon. What is the benefit of that? The benefit of that is you give that story, you tell that story, and there's no taking away from the story element of a narrative. So that's one style. Another style is narrative applications. So in this, all the applications that are normally in the body of the sermon, let's say you have 3 points and you have 3 applications, you just take those applications and you pull them to the very end. So you tell the story, and then at the end, you give the 3 applications. So that's a nice variety. The difficulty of that is being able to hold their attention in the body of the sermon, because your applications and your illustrations are at the very end. So you got to hone in on your storytelling skills in the first part of this. Well, here's another. The homileticians who teach narratives would talk about, or actually do talk about, pure narrative style. So this has no introduction. This has no conclusion. You start at the beginning of the story and you end at the conclusion of the story. But I think that needs to be adjusted a little bit because we're really not preaching until we apply that sermon. Paul said, preach the word, reprove, rebuke, exhort. So give your explanation and then apply it by reproving, rebuking, and exhorting. So how I want to modify this. How can we modify this and every once in a great while preach a pure narrative? By giving one application at the very end. So it would basically be a one-point sermon. And I find an example of this in the ministry of Jesus. This is Luke 12. This is when he is answering a question that had been given to him. But he answers that question with a parable of the rich fool. You remember that story. Once he told that parable of the rich fool, he gave one application in Luke 12:21. So is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So I would take this pure narrative style. I would modify it. Start with the beginning of the story, end with it, but have your illustration and your application at the very end, and then just focus on that one point. That would be the main point of your sermon, and it becomes the one point of your sermon. That would be variety. The frame narrative is just like the pure narrative, except you frame it with an introduction, and then you would conclude with our modified version of an application and an illustration at the end. Then you have the first person. Perhaps you've read first person sermons or even seen a first person sermon preached. Are very, very rare, I think. Is where you get in character of the person. Say Nehemiah, for example. I did a first person sermon only once in my life, and I did this in Bangladesh. I did Nehemiah chapter 3. I became Nehemiah, and I walked around the walls and gave a guided tour, and then I would give applications to that original audience of Israel. So that's variety. And then you have the inductive deductive style where you combine. And so it's sort of like that Ephesians chapter 6. You inductively lead up to the main point, and then you deductively develop it. So here's 10 different ways of doing a narrative, and 7 of them are inductive, which is unique, I think, and not quite as familiar. Here's a great textbook on this, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative by Stephen Mathewson. What is really good about this is he takes part of the book and gives us like hermeneutics of narratives. Narratives is such a unique genre, so different from poetry, apocalyptic material, so different from the epistles, which have paragraphs. So he tells us what is unique about narratives, and then he says we should uniquely preach them. We should uniquely preach this unique genre of Scripture, and he gives you variety of ways to do that. So that's a very helpful book if you're interested in pursuing this. So here's the simple plot of a narrative. So what does that mean? It means a narrative has a beginning. So I'm using the example of 1 Samuel 17. This is a David and Goliath story. And so you have a problem. So what's the problem? The problem is Goliath. So the conflict is introduced, and then there's suspense in this narrative, which is unique to narratives. And then there is the conflict resolved. So how was this conflict resolved? Well, it was resolved when David went out and met this enemy, not only of Israel, but of Israel's God, and defeated. So you had a biblical problem, and you have a biblical solution. And when you give the biblical solution, you have the end of the story. So that's the simple plot. That's the narrative. That's what's unique to narratives in the Old Testament, and that would be your way. That would be your way of preaching that. So here's just a few pointers. Where do you get the paragraphs for your manuscript sermon? And I'm sure we've learned that. That's what we've been doing this semester. But I want to go from this and talk about how can we reduce that manuscript sermon to an extended outline sermon that we would take into the pulpit. So this is where we got the paragraphs, right? In your attention step, you had a paragraph, interest step, a paragraph, introduce the subject step, a paragraph. Then when you get into the main divisions, each part of that main division, what is called the rhetorical processes, you have a paragraph for explanation, argumentation, illustration, application. But it's difficult for most of us to take a manuscript into the pulpit that's going to give us 30 minutes, 40 minutes of preaching, 10, 12, 15 pages of manuscript, and not be sort of chained to that manuscript and not giving eye contact with our audience. So what can we do? Well, we can reduce that manuscript to an extended outline to take into the pulpit. How do you do that? You take each paragraph and you reduce it to one sentence, maybe two sentences, that will jog your memory as you're working your way through that manuscript sermon. That doesn't mean that we memorize the paragraph. It means that we master the content of the paragraph so that all we need is to have our memory jogged with that one sentence. So we move from attention step, interest step, introduce a subject step with a sentence or two, and then when we get down into explanation, we have the paragraph reduced to one sentence. If you got a quote or a statistic that you know you cannot remember, sure, you can put that in there. But you're not tempted to read that manuscript. Now, some people, some pastors, they can have manuscripts and you never know it. Our Mark Dever is like that. But there's fewer of us that are able and capable of doing that. So that's the way. And I would encourage you when you preach your sermon for this class and you video it to do this. Practice this. If you orally go over that sermon several times, then you're going to be able to reduce that paragraph to one sentence and just work your way through it. This outline, I like to call it my safety net. If I'm making my way through the sermon and I forget what's next, well, I've got my safety net right there. I've got the next part of my sermon and the sentence that starts that paragraph or summarizes that paragraph. So here's a couple of books to help with preaching with variety. The first is called Preaching with Variety by Jeffrey Arthurs. And what he does, he takes the genres of the scripture, but he goes beyond books like Cracking the Old Testament Code, which tell us what is unique about each genre. And he says the form of scripture in each genre should influence the form of our sermon. So he goes beyond just telling us what is unique about these genres. He goes and teaches us how can that genre influence the form of my sermon, say with a narrative. So a narrative has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So should our sermon when we're preaching on a narrative. In other words, we shouldn't start in the middle of the narrative, go to the end of the narrative, and then finish the sermon with the beginning of the narrative. What does that do? It destroys the narrative. I've preached those sermons, and I know perhaps you have, and you have heard those sermons. And when you leave the service, you have no clue as to what that story was. It was so chopped up and moved around, the story was destroyed. And so that's a neat little book to help us in adding variety to our preaching, no matter what the genre is. And then the next one is Biblical Preaching, an Invitation to Biblical Preaching by Donald Sanukian. And this is an incredible book that can give you lots of variety in your preaching. His strong point is his application. I tried to use some of his examples in the blog post on application. His applications are so concrete with so many specifics that if you have a Donald Sanukian application, you don't need an illustration. It will serve the same purpose as the illustration. So this is really good if you want to think about how to add variety to my preaching. So here's an example. I'm just going to give you just one example of many examples found in Donald Sanukian. This is a deductive sermon where you got your main point of the sermon up front. So interest step, attention step, introduce the subject step, main point of the sermon, and here's what's unique to Donald Sanukian. In this one case, there's many other cases, mention all the main divisions with the main point of your sermon, and then give the transition to your main division. So that's not huge, but that's just one example of many that Donald Sanukian gives us. And then you have variety in the main variety in inductive preaching, not this nor this, but this. So again, this is sort of typical of narrative, and you're leading up to the solution. So here's how he would tell us to do this. Interest step, attention step, introduce the subject step, but instead of stating the main point of the sermon, ask a question. Ask a question, and then answer that question with not this nor this, but this. And that's what is unique about a narrative that gives you suspense that can even help hold their attention. So I hope this challenge of preaching the Bible with variety will help us to look for different ways to reflect our God, who is a God of infinite variety. We can even reflect that in our preaching. God bless.